Okay, folks, here we are starting our very first interactive blended unit module. This is the Reconstruction Introduction. Now, of course, this unit will include parts both for Reconstruction and for the Jim Crow unit, but we, of course, are starting with Reconstruction. And this shows you why Reconstruction was necessary. You'll notice that this was the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861. That started the Civil War. The fact of the Civil War and the issues that go along with it are some of the driving factors in making, as you see there, firing at Fort Sumter, making Reconstruction necessary. The death and destruction, not necessarily reconstructing society from so many people being killed, although that was part of it, but just the anger that would build up from this much death occurring. Here you see another element of that. This is the angle Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, what some people call the high point of the Confederacy, the furthest north they actually fought, sort of, kind of. But the fighting, the war that made Reconstruction necessary, Battle of the Wilderness, not that far from where we are in Northern Virginia, May 4th, 1864, men fighting through the woods. And then it came to an end, basically, or the beginning of the end, with General Lee surrendering to General Grant. On April 9th of 1865. That started a more direct approach to Reconstruction, although there were some efforts being made towards rebuilding the nation even before the war was over. And here you see President Lincoln visiting the freedmen, the African Americans who were no longer slaves, technically, when he visited Richmond after Richmond fell to the Union troops. This shows you another element that you, of course, would have learned about last year in 6th grade history, but it's talking about the start of the idea of freeing African Americans. Emancipation Proclamation, as you know, was issued in 1862, and it became law in 1863. Saying that all African Americans then being held as slaves were free. So it may not have freed any immediately, but the fact is it started people thinking in that direction more directly, that it was going to actually be possible, and that if a society built on slavery in both the North and the South, of course, slaves being the main labor force in the South, and factories, cotton mills in the New England area that got their cotton from the South would have to do some restructuring of the way things worked. And one of the ways restructuring was going on with the Emancipation Proclamation was African Americans now working as soldiers. Now this shows you, as you see there on the label, Company E, 4th United States Colored Troops. They would have fought in the Civil War. They were in a segregated unit, all African Americans. The U.S. Army would not be desegregated until much later, like 83 years later in 1865, or started 1865 to 1948 when the U.S. Army was finally desegregated, so that's about 83 years. But things were getting better. They were getting more rights. Yes, the physical buildings needed to be reconstructed. This is the railroad depot in Atlanta, Georgia. And that's what happened when the Confederates pulled out and it was exploded and set on fire. So buildings, entire cities, this is a street scene from Richmond, needed to be reconstructed. Now we start to get up into some of the issues we're going to be studying about in our Reconstruction unit. What you see here is the view of a white Southerner during the time period after the Civil War. Now don't read anything into his stone-faced expression, because to be honest with you, they had to maintain pretty much not moving the way photography worked back then. But the thing you can't pay attention to is this right here. His finger is on the trigger of his revolver, and if this is what they call a single action revolver, that means you have to pull the hammer back in order to pull the trigger to fire the gun. And you might not think that's such a big deal, but if one of the purposes of having this picture taken was intimidation, as in I've got my pistol cocked and it's ready to fire, intimidation of African Americans, then it shows you that people's thinking would be one of the things that would need to be reconstructed, people's actions. And here you see something that was very encouraging. The first colored African American senator and representatives. Why do you say were they the first? Why did it have to wait until Reconstruction time period? Well, before this time period, before the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, African Americans were not even considered citizens. With the passage of the 14th Amendment, and then in 1870, passage of the 15th Amendment guaranteeing African American men the right to vote, these men could hold political office. But there was still the violence to deal with. Organizations you'll be learning about, especially the KKK and the White League, that would work together to produce a life in some respects worse than slavery, because it was using violence, burning down schoolhouses that had been started for African American children, lynching where they would kill people. These things were happening that would cause a need for Reconstruction. One of the organizations that was built up was the Freedmen's Bureau. Now here you see a Freedmen's Bureau representative still dressed in his Union Army uniform, stopping a fight between white Southerners in this town and African Americans. That was not the only thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did, but it's one of the things you will be learning about during our unit on Reconstruction. Because one of the main things they did was they established schools for children. And again, you might say, why is that a big deal? Well, when they were being held as slaves, when they were enslaved, they technically weren't allowed to learn to read and write. Now they were. And I don't know whether you agree with me at this point in the year or not, but education is a tool that can help you gain success. And these people really, really wanted it. And then another thing we'll be learning about, and we sort of just mentioned it earlier, was the right to vote for African American men. Not African American women, that wouldn't be till 1920, but African American men gained the right to vote in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment. And the last thing we'll be talking about in this brief introduction. Now, we're not talking specifically about General Swain. We're just simply mentioning the fact that he was a Union general. He led the Freedmen's Bureau in Alabama. And he oversaw the establishment, as in the starting, of secondary schools. Secondary as in from 6th grade on, in Selma, Montgomery, and Mobile, Alabama. Now, I want you to store in the back of your mind for the springtime when we study the Civil Rights Unit those two names, Selma and Montgomery. In any case, why was the Union Army needed in the South to enforce, as in make sure the Southern people paid attention to all those Reconstruction policies like the Freedmen's Bureau and giving African Americans the right to vote and other ones that we'll get into? But why was the Union Army? Now, I'm not going to answer that right now, but it's one of the things I do want you to think about. So, after you listen to this video, you can go back and listen to it a second time, taking notes with the note guide that you're given. And then you can look those notes over, and when you feel you're ready, go ahead and take the formative assessment. Goodbye.